Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. And today, Roger and I are going to go back in time to the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Back actually when Roger was still resting secure in his tomb, undisturbed. Back in those days, when I was first starting to read. And we're going to talk about some of the first books that I read when I was a little kid and how they influenced me as a reader going forward. Of course, like most children, the first things that I read were children's books. But I'm not going to talk about those. I can't even remember most of the children's books I read. I remember Curious George and Frog and Toad are Friends. I remember some children's books. But I'm mostly going to be talking about the fiction that was written that was geared more towards adults, or at least not geared specifically towards children. I'm also not going to be talking about the thing I read the most when I was around that age, which is comic books. I read a vast amount of comic books, as I still do. I read tons of comics. Mostly Marvel superhero comics, but also other stuff. War comics. Sergeant Rock was, a staple. I read a lot of Sergeant Rock and Jonah Hex, the DC Western comic, and just, all kinds of comics I would read, but mostly Marvel superhero comics. I read a vast amount of those. But I'm not going to talk about those today. I'm going to be talking about the books that I read, the actual books, like I said, geared more towards adults. A lot of the books that I read when I was a little kid, before I started reading fiction, like novels and collections of short stories and things like that, I was reading a lot of books that I would find in the library that were mostly nonfiction, books about animals and dinosaurs, that kind of thing. My mother would take me to the library once or twice a week. Pretty often she took me to the library. And I read a lot about animals, but I also read a lot about monsters. There were some nonfiction books about werewolves and vampires, just about the legends of werewolves and vampires and the history of werewolves and vampires. I wish I could remember the titles of these books, but they were at the library, so I would only, have them a week or two at a time, and it was a long time ago. But books like that, and also books about horror movies, which I like. The only one I actually have that I read when I was a kid is this book. This is It's Alive, the classic cinema saga of Frankenstein. Of course, like I said, I was obsessed with the Universal horror movies. And this is by Gregory William Mank. And it's all about the old Frankenstein films. So it's pretty specific to the Frankenstein movies. It doesn't go off too much to the other Universal movies, except when they connect with the Frankenstein series. And when was this book written? I can't remember. I think it was the early 1980s. In 1981, this book came out. Yeah. This book came out. So I was reading books like this even before this one was published. In the library, there'd be books about monsters and horror movies. And then I remember this one specifically. And I did eventually pick this one up. So yeah, I read stuff like that. But as far as the actual novels and collections of short stories and things, the first book I ever read, and I've mentioned this quite a few times before, was Dracula. Dracula, when I was a little kid, was a character that existed in a lot of different films. So I didn't think of Dracula when I was a kid as being a character from fiction. He was, to me, a character that existed in many movies, in different stories. And he was usually played by Christopher Lee. And Bela Lugosi and some other actors in the old Universal horror movies, but mostly Christopher Lee. But then I saw my mom reading this book, and it was this edition of of Dracula. And I had to read it. I had to read Dracula, the book. And I was too young. I don't remember how old I was, but I was too young to really get a lot of what was going on in this book, because I was just a little kid when I started reading this. But I was fascinated by it, and particularly the opening portions that take place in Dracula's castle when Jonathan Harker was in Dracula's castle. I just found that stuff absolutely riveting. And, I read the whole book, and I read it a few times as I was growing up, but I remember that first reading specifically. And so I have a great affection for this particular edition of Dracula with this awesome cover, because it really was the first time I had ever attempted to read an actual novel. And it took me a long time to read it, but I read it. So Dracula was the very first book that I read. And again, mostly because of my interest in monsters and the things I was watching on television, which is kind of a theme for a while when I was a little kid, as you'll see. Because the next book I read was Planet of the Apes. I have, of course, a copy of Planet of the Apes. But this cover that is floating magically in the air, this is the first edition of Planet of the Apes that I ever saw. This was the paperback that was around when I was a kid. It has a crap cover. The cover on this is not great. But this is the copy of Planet of the Apes that I read when I was a kid, because I loved that movie. I mean, it was talking apes. How could you not love it? And this is the first time I realized just how different a book and a movie could be. Because the story is very, very different in the Planet of the Apes book than it was in the film, which I had seen a few times before I read the book, because it was on television a lot when I was a kid. All the Planet of the Apes movies were. But this was just very, very different. I liked it. I liked the book a lot. It kind of blew my mind that this was just so different. The characters were all different, and the ending was very different. It was a whole different thing, the book. And this is the first time I ever thought, wow, stories can really diverge. And I realized that the movie was based on the book, but it was just interesting how different it was. I did end up getting as many Planet of the Apes books as I could. My favorite was this one. This is Man the Fugitive by George Alec Effinger. And this was based on the television show, the Planet of the Apes television show. And they did play the Planet of the Apes television show on TV when I was a kid. The show itself had been canceled after one season in the earlier 70s. I forget which year Planet of the Apes TV show came on. Maybe 74. I don't remember. But by the time I saw it, they were all packaged up as they would put 2 episodes together and play them as Planet of the Apes movies. And this was a book based on a couple of the episodes, 2 or 3 of the episodes from the television show. And I thought it was pretty great. But this is one of the first books I read, Man the Fugitive by George Alec Effinger. And of course, the next thing I remember reading is Star Wars. Star Wars, which is a novel by Alan Dean Foster, who ghost wrote the book. It says it was written by George Lucas, but it was not. It was based on his script. But of course, Star Wars was huge, and I had already seen the movie Star Wars when I read the book. And of course, I loved the book. This is back in the days when Star Wars was just one movie. It was just one movie called Star Wars. And of course, all of us little kids who saw it, I saw it when I was 6. I read the book maybe a couple years later. I don't really remember. I think it was probably a couple years later, a year or 2 maybe. But loved it. Loved the book. I remember I remember finding the book really interesting because there were some differences in the book from the film. There was more stuff in the book, and I just found that kind of cool. Also, what I read a lot around this same time were actually books about another thing that I watched a lot on television, which is Star Trek. At the library where I used to go when I was a little kid, there were these books. I eventually picked all of these up because I loved these so much when I was a little kid. This is the Star Trek Reader, and so this collects some of the novelized episodes that James Blish wrote. James Blish wrote a series of, I think it ended up being 12 books, maybe 13, of novelized episodes of the original series of Star Trek. Again, when I read these, Star Trek was just one show, Star Trek, which was canceled. And so it only existed, Star Trek only existed as reruns and that movie, Star Trek, the motion picture. And I read all of the Star Trek readers. There were 4 of them. And I have them all. So this is the Star Trek Reader, Star Trek Reader 2. These have great covers, which were taken from the paperback versions of these. Star Trek Reader 3. And Star Trek Reader 4. This one was fun because it actually has an original novel, Spock Must Die, which is kind of a ridiculous book. And it had things, even when I was a little kid reading this in the library, I was like, wait a minute, that's weird. But Star Trek was great, and Spock Must Die was just kind of a crap Star Trek novel, actually, but I loved these books. The actual novelized episodes were awesome. And so, of course, I had to get all of the Star Trek readers when I became old and nostalgic. So I read those. I remember reading those. Now, another book I read very early when I was a little kid, I don't remember exactly when, but it sticks out in my mind. Again, another book based on a television show, which I was kind of obsessed with. And the book was More Stories from the Twilight Zone. More Stories from the Twilight Zone. And I read this book a few times when I was a kid. I found it. I don't remember where I found it. I'm sure my mother bought it for me, wherever I found it. And eventually I picked up the other Twilight Zone books written by Rod Serling, because he wrote 3 Twilight Zone collections of short stories. And they did very well, actually. The television show was pretty popular in its first few years on the air. And so the books sold very, very well. They sold pretty much as well as the James Blish Star Trek books did, or at least close to it. And this was the first one I read, and I just found it great. A book on the Twilight Zone. I mean, how awesome is that? I thought it was pretty great. So right around that time, it was after I read all of that stuff that I finally read Frankenstein. And the copy of Frankenstein I read was this one. This was the edition of Frankenstein, the paperback edition of Frankenstein, that I wish I still had, but I don't. But I don't know what happened to this paperback. I don't remember how I got the paperback. But this was the first edition of Frankenstein I read, and again, I thought it was great. Again, much like Planet of the Apes, I was surprised by the differences that I found in this book. Frankenstein, much like Dracula, was a character that existed in many movies. And much like Dracula, I hadn't thought of Frankenstein as a character from one story. He was in a bunch of different stories and in a bunch of different movies. Mostly, I thought of the Universal Horror Frankensteins, although there were the Hammer Frankenstein movies, which I didn't like as much. But the character in this book is so different that I was just like, wow. And this character is an intelligent creature. And I sympathized with this character even more than I sympathized with the Boris Karloff character from the films. It was a really interesting reading experience. And it was from there, I started moving off into things that were not based on TV shows. The next book that I remember reading was this one, Almuric by Robert E. Howard, which I picked up because on the back cover of this edition of Almuric, of course I still have Almuric, I just don't have this edition anymore. On the back cover of this edition, it mentioned that Robert E. Howard was the guy who created Conan, which surprised me. I remember being surprised because I knew Conan very well from the Marvel comic book. And I thought that Conan was a character created by Marvel Comics. I didn't realize that Conan was based on a character from these old stories written by Robert E. Howard. And that's mostly because I read a lot of the color comic book. At this point, I wasn't reading Savage Sword of Conan, the Conan magazine. I didn't even find out about that until later. But I read the Conan color comic book pretty regularly. And so I was like, what? This guy created Conan? So I read Almuric and loved it. It was just fantastic. I'd never read anything quite like this, with this energy and drive. And it was my first taste of Robert E. Howard. I read this before I discovered Edgar Rice Burroughs. And so this book led me to those other things. It led me to find the Conan paperbacks, which were out at the time. It led me on a hunt for other Robert E. Howard books. And I just became a more dedicated reader of other things. Of course, after that, I found A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And it was this edition that I first read A Princess of Mars in, which I have. I have it stored away somewhere. But this was the Michael Whelan cover of A Princess of Mars. I've got it, of course, right there on the shelf. But this is the Michael Whelan cover. And I first read all of the Mars series with the books that had the Michael Whelan covers, which when I was a kid, you could just go into any bookstore and buy the whole series, which is not true anymore. But I read these. These led me to Tarzan. Tarzan was a character that I was not very interested in, because to me, Tarzan was just some naked guy running through the woods in those old movies, running through the forest, hanging out with, apes. But I had no interest in this, naked dumb guy in the jungle. But it turns out Tarzan in the books was a lot more interesting than that. And so from this book, I went to those books and became obsessed with Edgar Rice Burroughs and read almost every book that Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote. I read every one that I could find. And it was easy to find Edgar Rice Burroughs when I was a young kid around this time. I had to be around 12 when I read all that stuff. And you could just, like I said, you can go to any bookstore and pick up piles of Edgar Rice Burroughs books. Not quite the same anymore. And right around this same time, of course, I read The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I loved it. I loved The Hobbit. This is the edition of The Hobbit that I first read. Of course, I've got an edition on my shelf that's really nice and fancy pants right there. But this is the edition that I first read The Hobbit. It took me a long time to finally get around to reading The Lord of the Rings for some reason. I don't think I read that until I was 13 or around there, even though I loved The Hobbit so much. I loved The Hobbit. But I recognized that The Lord of the Rings, which was a much bigger book, and it looked different. Lord of the Rings just seemed more intimidating than The Hobbit did. But eventually I got to it and, of course, loved it, of course. But The Hobbit, I read The Hobbit a lot, as I think many kids did. It was my gateway into Middle Earth and that kind of fantasy story. But then after all of that, I found the book that really kind of twisted my mind for all time afterwards. And that was a book called The Tomb by H.P. Lovecraft. This was my introduction to H.P. Lovecraft in a whole different kind of horror. I moved on from H.P. Lovecraft after this to, Edgar Allan Poe and some other writers, but this was some interesting stuff, The Tomb. I had never read anything quite like what Lovecraft wrote. He used all kinds of words. Not only did I not know them, I'd never heard them before, these words. What are you talking about? What is Eldritch and gibbous? I didn't know what a gibbous moon was, but he talked about this kind of stuff, and it was interesting. This was my first exposure to H.P. Lovecraft. Eventually, my stepfather got me the whole set of the Arkham House books because I was so interested in this author. And yeah, that changed everything for me, the Arkham House books, which led me on a dark and terrible path, which, eventually caused me to reanimate ancient corpses and to read a lot more horror. But those are the books that really turned me into a reader of fiction. You'll see that unlike many people, my taste has not changed pretty much at all since I was a little kid. I pretty much like all the same stuff that I liked when I was a kid. I like the same kind of stuff. I don't know what that says about me. I've never really changed my tastes as far as reading goes. Oh well. I will shut up now because I've talked forever. I will catch you next time.